Good evening, dear colleagues and friends. I'm also happy to welcome you to this debate, which, as probably Tatiana has mentioned, is organized by the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna and Visual Culture Research Center. And I think that this kind of topic that we have today about Gayropa is one of the most important and crucial issues regarding the framework of the school, which is about the abduction of Europe. So I would say that Gayropa is actually an indicator or one of the forms that this abduction or kidnapping can take, because first of all it indicates that Europe, the issue of Europe, the question of Europe, is always a gender issue. So Europe has been always a gendered subject, and it is especially important here in Ukraine to discuss this issue publicly, because it has some background, of course, and it tells a lot about the Ukrainian perception that Europe is somehow associated with some types of approaches, attitudes and practices regarding body, corporeality, sexuality, gender and sex in general. So I think that it's very important, especially concerning our institutional past of Visual Culture Research Center, because I can say that we are touching here one of the most driven issues in the Ukrainian context, one of the most sensible ones for at least for political spectrum here, because what I also can say from on behalf of institutions, that very often, as we know it from our experience, the very raising of this issue can easily evoke censorship, hatred, violence, and so on. So I'm really happy that we have this discussion within the Biennial framework. And the last thing, but not least, what I wanted to mention is that it's also sort of the question of ideological and precise political analysis, because it's really needed in case of the word Gayropa, because it's still unclear what does it presuppose, what kind of floating signifier is that. So what does it really include, and actually what do they want, those who are afraid of Gayropa? Because if we want to get the right answer, we have to ask the proper question. So, and I think the title of this debate is really a brilliant example for that. But apart from that, I think that the real secret lies in answering the next question after this one. Why are they afraid of Gayropa? Yeah, I think answering this question, we will reveal sort of obscene truth, probably of collective character. And I'm also happy that Anton Shechhovtsov is moderating this debate. It's really a very precise choice. So I will introduce the moderator, and Anton will introduce the rest of the speakers. So Anton Shechhovtsov, again, very welcome at the Biennial. He is a visiting senior fellow at the Legatum Institute in the UK, and his main fields of research are the new radical right in Europe, and not only, also the Russian new right, and currently Anton is working on the book on Putin and the European far right. So I wish you an intensive debate, and thanks again. Please.
Thank you, Vasil. I was first thinking of addressing to you as ladies and gentlemen, dear trans ladies and trans gentlemen, agenders, postgenders, etc., but then I thought I would obviously forget someone. So I just addressed to you as dear colleagues, friends, and dear guests. We are here today to discuss many things because, as Vasil mentioned, this is a very broad topic. This is about gender, this is about gay rights, this is about various sexual practices and about people who are trying to acquire equal rights in the society, in Western societies and European societies. It is also about the reaction and response from some of the reactionary forces in Europe, which we sometimes refer as conservative or far-right, but not necessarily these forces are at the heart of this reaction or response, or negative response towards the gender activism or gender movement or people who try to fight for the rights of gay people. So it is, of course, very, very difficult to address all these issues, but we'll try. And I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce to you the discussants of this panel. Маши Ґессен is a Russian-American journalist and the author of 7 books, including The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. She also writes and speaks extensively on LGBT issues. And last year she co-edited the book called Gay Propaganda, Love Stories from Russia. Andrea Pето is a professor in the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. She serves on the board of several journals in the field of women's history and contemporary European history. Her most recent published book is the co-edited volume, Women and the Holocaust, New Perspectives and Challenges. Mіке Velloo is professor in comparative politics and inequality issues at Radboud University in Nijmegen. Is this correct pronunciation? And a non-resident permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, as Daniel has already mentioned. Mieke's research experience lies mainly in the field of equality policies, feminist methodology, and social movements. And one of her most recent books is Multiple Meanings of Gender Equality. And last but not least, Marіі Маєрчик is a Ukrainian historian and social anthropologist based at the Institute of Technology, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Her research concentrates on feminist, gender and queer studies and other related areas. And her latest book is Body and Ritual, Structural and Semantic Analysis of Ukrainian Rights of the Family Cycle. My first question would be to Masha Ґессен, though. And if you Google the word Gayropa in English, Google will bring you to some websites that sells gay stuff. If you Google this word in Russian or obviously Ukrainian, that will be the same, it will take you to some nationalist websites. And I tried to do some very preliminary, very basic research, and I found out that this word Gayropa, it comes from the Russian discourse. Maybe it was co-authored by Ukrainians as well, but the first mentions of this word would come from Russia. And I also tried to understand how it came into mainstream, and I think some of the pro-government newspapers like Komsomolskaya Pravda was trying to even promote this term. And again, what's interesting, at the end of 2013, one of the most popular speakers for the Russian Orthodox Church, senior deacon Andrei Kurayev, he was expelled, he was fired from the Institute of Moscow Spiritual Academy for writing in his blog on a scandal about some gay priests in the church. And in one of his interviews to one Russian publication called Slon, he talks about what he called hypocrisy. And he was saying that it is hypocritical for the priests who participate in gay orgies at night and then condemn Gayropa in the morning. But is it really a hypocrisy? Or in other words, is this word Gayropa is only about gays? Does it have a bigger political meaning in Russia? What do you think, Masha?
think that that's something that qualifies as a leading question. Yes, of course, it has a much bigger political meaning, and I think that the whole anti-gay campaign in Russia, which as a campaign I think dates back roughly to the spring of 2012, it's not a literal campaign against gays and lesbians or LGBT people in general, although LGBT people have suffered many terrible literal consequences of this campaign. But it is, of course, a symbolic campaign. And LGBT people are chosen very precisely as a symbol of this campaign because it's such a perfect encapsulation of everything that Russia is currently reacting against. Right? So, who are gay people? Gay people are people who didn't exist until after the Soviet Union collapsed. It's the only group in Russia that didn't exist until the Soviet Union collapsed. And that's actually not a joke, right? And it's funny because when I speak to Western audiences, it always gets a laugh, this line that, a much bigger laugh than the snicker I just got. Because what a funny concept that gay people didn't exist before 1991. But gay people didn't exist before 1991, right? People who loved people of the same sex existed, and people who formed various relationships existed. But people who claimed an allegiance to a group, people who claimed an identity, people who claimed rights that accrued to that group or to themselves on the basis of belonging to that group, they did not exist until 1991, right? So it's a very precise target. It immediately communicates that we're fighting everything that is foreign, that was brought to us, that was forced upon us, that was the phrase usually used as forced down our throats, in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the best way to turn history back and to return to a place of comfort and safety and clarity is to get rid of the gay people. And of course that doesn't mean gay people literally, it means everything that's new and foreign, everything that represents the expansive Western civilization which is forcing its values down our throats. And we have to protect ourselves.
And Andrea, of course, Hungarian context is quite different from the Russian context and the Ukrainian. Do you have any particular terms to, just condemn something that is too liberal for some, and at the same time connected to this gender movement on gender activism, or even, because some of those very ultra-conservative groups, they would refer to gender as a gender ideology. Is there a gender ideology? What do you think?
You are asking the wrong person. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for the invitation. This concept, gender ideology, actually, according to our research, popped up in 2006 in Germany. So this is the moment for advertisement. Here is our book, Gender as Symbolic Glue. I carried myself several copies, so you can pick them up later from that desk. And here we actually made a European survey how actually gender ideology as a concept was developed and in relation to the different political parties. Because as you have mentioned, Anton, in this wonderful introduction, that's a really complex phenomenon. And from this comparison, this book is about France, Germany, Hungary, Poland and Slovakia, because you have to start somewhere, and the scholarly investigation of this particular new phenomenon has just started. So I might say in the past 2 years, secular feminist activists recognize that something has changed. Something has changed in the European context, and first we have to understand. But the question is, do we have the vocabulary? Do we know what we want to understand? And if I want to answer very simply to the question, in Hungary, is really very different from Russia, and it's also very different from Poland and Slovakia, if we look at this Central European context. And it's very different because in Slovakia, the highest ranking official of the state administration dealing with gender equality was attacked in her office. In Poland, one of the leading feminists was giving a talk in a Dominican church, was attacked by a smoke bomb. So in these countries, the situation around this concept of gender ideology had gone so extreme that it is not the case in Hungary. So what you see in this book, if you take the time and read it, it's also available online. You see that in Hungary there were several factors which actually so far, I knock 3 times on wood, this gender ideology debate hasn't started yet. It doesn't mean that there were no signs. The first instance was in 2006 when I put together a textbook for secondary level history education, and there was when it was published, there was a question in the Hungarian parliament that how come that taxpayers' money is spent on this textbook which is spreading gender ideology, and I was just, what is this? And then it really, in certain places, it's present, but definitely the trigger is very different in different countries. And in Hungary, this trigger hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened, surprisingly, due to this recent wave of refugees. Because the Hungarian government made a decision to start a poster campaign for promoting family values on the 15th of September 2015. And all the feminists and secular human rights activists were just, ooh, what will be this be? Because previously the campaign was against the migrants and protecting so-called Hungary from the migrants. And this campaign hasn't happened so far, although there is the government decision. So, going back to the question, in Hungary this whole gender ideology debate is taking a very different form, partly because of the approach of some actors in the field who are actually promoting dialogue. And this dialogue is still possible in Hungary, unlike in Slovakia, in Poland or in France, for example, when millions of people are protesting on the streets against gay marriage. This is a phenomenon we have to understand. We have to understand because 1 million people on the street is a kind of fact in the I think that we first have to critically reflect on our inability to forecast this is happening, and then we can move forward.
Yeah, thank you. Well, from Andrea, from one of your articles, I know that basically the gender ideology is a wrong term. This is something, you know, that is used against this liberal thought about gender equality. And then my next question is to Mieke. What are we talking about when we talk about gender? Basically, what is it? Going back to the basics, what is gender equality? What is gender? Are we talking about, you know, just sex, which is the same as gender?
Yeah. Yeah, it's in 2 minutes for an audience that largely, I think, has a lot of ideas about that also. So, I think gender comes from feminist activism and from feminist theory, and originally was a word to try and distinguish between what people do, how they feel, how life is organized, and what kind of biological sex people have. So originally it was a term that was making a distinction between the form of a body and then all the rest of the social construction that happens to be there on top of it. Later on, people came to see that also this whole idea that we have two biological sexes is part of this whole phenomenon of social construction. So, but underneath this, and what is very important to realize is that gender is something that you find on all dimensions of life. It's a very important part of people's identity, of people's subjectivity, their ability to be a person and to actually do something. It's a very important part of their behavior, of all the choices they make about their behavior, about the roles, the positions they take in society, about the institutions that we have on all domains of life. So it is from the macro level to the psyche of people. You find ideas of what is sex and gender and what is the proper way of doing this. So it's a normative position next to a defining position about what reality is. And that makes it so pervasive and so powerful, because it's almost impossible for anyone to imagine a world without gender. And it's also almost impossible if you would make that decision to live a life without gender, to live such a life in the world that we have, no matter if that's Iceland or Ukraine or anywhere else in the world. So feminists have been calling for a transformation of society that is total, that envisages everything, both internally in people, both the bodies of people, and what happens in the world. So in that sense, I think the first question in the panel description, which is why are the politics of gender and sexuality polarizing our societies? It's, I think, just an expression that gender and sexuality have been rising to the level of what's called high politics. We were always complaining as feminists that people didn't think it's important enough. It's not real politics. Well, you know, welcome to the world where suddenly it is real politics. It's what we wanted, in a sense, right? So, apparently it's not just only good that it has this. So, if that helps, I think I forgot the sexuality part and how we organize our desires, and but I think this audience probably understands that.
Maria, going back to somewhere closer to where we are now, Ukraine, and as I mentioned, Gayropa as the word, it's being used in the Russian discourse, nationalist discourse mostly, and Ukrainian as well. So what are discursive differences, if there are any, or similarities between the Russian context and Ukrainian context for homophobia in these two countries? Is it the same source for it, or there are different sources, religious, cultural, or political?
Thank you, Anton, for your questions, and thank you, organizers, for inviting me to participate in this panel. I would say the question about differences and similarities between Ukraine and Russia is quite political now, because we are more inclined to speak about differences now than about similarities. And when we speak about differences, we always try to diminish homophobia in Ukraine and diminish if it is possible, and exaggerate the problems in Russia. And it seems to me that this trend is grounded in post-Maidan situation, in war situation, and probably also in neoliberal LGBT strategies. It is commonly recognized that Russia has adopted quite a homophobic legislation, and the average level of homophobia in Russia, in Russian society, is quite high. But Ukraine has never pretended to be a country that is tolerant towards LGBT. We just stopped one step before quite a terrible homophobic law passed at Ukrainian parliament. And still there is political forces in Ukrainian parliament that will go on with the new attempts to criminalize LGBT visibility in the society or mass media. Moreover, in Ukraine, I don't know if it is common elsewhere. In Ukraine, I have this note. Many Ukrainian scholars in gender studies insist that gender theory has nothing in common with LGBT studies, and that endeavors to present LGBT issues as part of gender politics sabotage, and this is the aim is this consideration of LGBT issues as part of gender questions. This aims at discrediting of gender movement. We have this expression, gender movement. I don't know how much it is usual outside of Ukraine to see gender theory and gender studies as sort of political movement. It seems to me that this expression, gender movement, simply replaced the feminism as a kind of a grassroots activism. So for me, we have to consider the situation. Okay, when we are looking for differences, we always inclined to diminish this problem. And let me recall the recent, it was called social experiment. Social experiment that were organized by journal Bird in Flight. If you heard about the project. 2 men participated in the project. They were walked in Kyiv street, holding each other's hands, and camera filmed them and filmed the reaction of people around in the street. Camera recorded how pedestrians stared of 2 men, talked to them, asking them kiss each other, took pictures of them, encouraged them to buy flowers for a madam, and asserted they have never seen such a people before. At the end of the walk, these 2 men were fiercely beaten, were fiercely attacked by a group of far rights. And group consisted of 2 or more people, and 10 or more people. So when participants tried to make a conclusion of the experiment, the conclusion was that in Ukraine situation is better than in Russia. A similar experiment took place in Russia before, and so they tried to compare the situations. So of course, if we don't take into account this attack by far right, and if we interpret these comments in the street as quite friendly, then we may agree that in Ukraine the situation is better. But I think it is not so much good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I now have a question to all of you to discuss and speculate, maybe, about a question about the correlation between gay rights, this gender movement, if we can call it, and liberal democracy. The question why I'm thinking about this, the answers may be too obvious, but let's remember that homosexual acts were criminalized in the UK until 1967. And one of the geniuses, British geniuses, Alan Turing, who cracked the Enigma code of the Third Reich during the war, he was given a choice, and he was gay, and he was given a choice either go to jail or take treatment, and he chose treatment, and then he finally committed suicide. And wasn't the UK a liberal democracy before 1967, and I would say that only in 1994 they gave equal rights to gay people in the UK. So they decriminalized it in 1966, but still in 1994 they offered only equal rights to gay people. That was about the age of consent. So can a liberal democracy exist without gay rights? Or is it now an obligatory element of a liberal democracy? What do you think?
Sure. So it's a fascinating question. I recently, when the U.S. Supreme Court passed its most recent marriage equality decision in June of 2015, and when something happens in America, Americans are convinced that it's happened for the first time in the world. So the fact that that the United States became the 20th country in the world to fully legalize same-sex marriage was irrelevant. This was a huge leap forward for mankind, and it was. But I wrote a long essay about this as sort of my personal reaction to it for, of all places, Vogue magazine, and I had the most fascinating editorial interaction because I made certain assertions in the piece that were sort of my starting points, and one of them was that I was already a working journalist covering a U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1989, I believe, when the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the legality of sodomy laws in the case Hartwig versus Georgia. Hartwig versus Bowers, the sodomy laws in the state of Georgia. This was less than a generation ago. Or I like to think it was less than a generation ago. And the editor had a very difficult time believing that. They ran and passed the fact checker several times. The editor is obviously younger than I am. And another assertion was that I wrote about being queer in the 80s and having a best friend who was an American student studying Russian, and how he couldn't get a job with, he knew, even though he was a Russian studies person, that he couldn't get a job with the State Department because the US State Department at the time had an official policy that excluded homosexuals from serving the State Department because they were a priori subject to blackmail. They were a priori vulnerable to blackmail. And the editor couldn't believe that was true. So we had this weird exchange of letters where she kept writing to me, but it had to be an informal policy. I said, no, really, seriously, this was on paper. It was a little difficult to dig up because we're talking about the 1980s, and finally she came around and she was shocked. So it's a measure of just how rapid this social change has been, and how, you're absolutely right to point out that this is, it's a very strange assertion to say that this is an integral part of liberal democracy, when something has, when it was a part of liberal democracy less than a generation ago. At the same time, at the risk of sounding obvious, I think that liberal democracies, by their nature, are always in the process of legalizing minorities and assimilating minorities, often as with gay people, in exchange for those minorities sort of choosing a conservative social path in the movement. But that process is constantly underway, and it is no accident that Russia, for one, has chosen to focus on the LGBT movement as sort of the focal point of its anti-Western campaign, because that is, in fact, the forefront of social change right now in the West as well, and it is a fault line or a front line of a global cultural war.
Yeah, just to probably add something, going back to the UK. Now, the party that is promoting gay rights at the moment most actively is the Conservative Party in Great Britain. So it's You know, and now we can even not say that, you know, conservatives are all bad, they're all anti-gay. And Mieke, I mean, the same question about liberal democracy, but I'm also fascinated with your country and with the gay rights agenda coming from the far right. Pim Fortuyn, who was openly gay, he was considered to be a right-wing populist, but at the same time he was very active in gay rights movement.
And he was a right-wing politician. So I think, to go back to your question, I think first of all we need to see that liberal democracy is kind of a narrative about what we would like the world to be, and next to that there is total imperfect realities of entities claiming to be and seem to be liberal democracies. I'm from Belgium. That's also a liberal democracy. My mother could not vote for a long time because Belgium got a women's vote in 1949, after World War II, right? The Netherlands is seen as a progressive liberal democracy. They only recognized marital rape as being rape in 1992. So you can point at all these countries and see how they don't have equal treatment yet on any dimension you choose. The Netherlands, you would think, have equal treatment for men and women. It's not true, because there's still some remnants of differences between lesbian women and other women, and there is still some things that need to be fixed. We still don't have good equality for trans people. We still have all sorts of xenophobic bits in our marriage laws. So you can marry anyone, can marry any other adult if they're 18, except if that person is from a non-Western country and you are 18, that's too young. You have to be 21, or it might be have been up to 24, and you have to earn more than 120% of the minimum wage, otherwise you cannot marry someone from Turkey. So we don't have equal treatment yet, and it's not just gender equality, it's not just LGBT equality, it's also equality connected to those people that we racialize. And so in that sense, I think liberal democracies is, you have to take them serious as a political project and try to keep them to their promises or to what they say they will do. But because they don't do it yet. They need to be pushed in the right direction all the time, even in those countries that we think are there yet, because they're not. And I know that the Netherlands is a wonderful country. In a lot of senses, it's the country of my choice. I wasn't born there, I moved there from Belgium. It was a lot better than Belgium. It still is, but still, it's not up to what it says it is. And a lot of countries are like that. So I think there is a deep connection also between gender and thinking about sexual equality, because as long as you see men and women as fundamentally different people that have this wonderful complementarity that is linked to desire, how can you then understand that two women or two men love each other or desire each other? You can't, because it doesn't fit in your whole understanding of desire. So it is very strongly connected.
Andrea, your country, Hungary, is now officially a illiberal democracy. What about anti-gender liberal democracy or anti-gender illiberal democracy? I mean, where is this discussion now in Hungary in terms of, are they going to accept some of the, you know, feminist of gay rights, or what's the process now? Is Orban moving towards accepting or rejecting everything in terms of gay rights? Same-sex marriage, is it on the agenda?
I think there are 2 points here. One is that what this ill-famous illiberalism means or it doesn't mean, and the other is that I think that the mainstream conservatism has a problem. So let me start with the latter one, that there is a new political force, which is the far right, which appeared in Hungary in its great form. And this actually is hijacking most of the concepts, ideas, appropriating those family-related discourse, which was previously the territory of the conservatives. Therefore, what we see is that the polarization of the political spectrum, and from the right you have got an extremely strong force which is eating up the space which is in the center, and surprisingly the conservatives have got no other space but go to the left and be as liberal as possible. So I would like to underline that if you look at the Hungarian context, on the one hand you see these discourses which is interpreted very often as that the center-right conservative government is trying to attract the voters from the far right. On the other hand, in the practices, you see lots of attempts to attract the moderates in the center. If you look at the electoral mathematics, 35–45% of the Hungarian voters are undecided. They don't have a party, which is a pretty high number. So the 2018 elections will be really decided by who will get this group who is in the middle. You cannot attract those who are in the far right because they are the most decided voters. So what it is in the middle, that's the question, who will win them over. And if you look at the policy level, the Hungarian government just set up a new parliamentary committee which is called the Committee on Women's Dignity. And of course, the first reaction if you see dignity is, you know, immediately you start trembling because this concept is coming very strongly from the Vatican and from this type of discourse. On the other hand, if you look at the agenda and the mandate of this committee, it is very much the implementation of the CEDAW Commission recommendations. So I think that you can interpret the Hungarian situation from different angles, like, you know, you look in the kaleidoscope from different angles. I'm a person of glass half full in this context, because I believe that there are some ways to collaborate and to work with people who are reasonable, and that's the reason why this dialogue forum, which is organized by the Ebert Foundation, is so successful, and without any humbleness, I think it contributed that in Hungary this anti-gender movement, so-called anti-gender movement, hasn't really started because there are people both on the conservative and the leftist and the liberal side who are actually interested in a kind of meaningful dialogue. So my suggestion is to look at the different levels, policy levels, spaces where this discussion is happening.
And Maria, going back to Ukraine, and talking about this, you know, liberal democracy and its correlation with the gay rights and gender movement, again, remembering about the experiences with the UK, with the US, and okay, is Ukraine ready? Is Ukraine ready to accept the newest form of being, say, liberal, which is now gay rights, same-sex marriages?
Well, yes, I think Ukraine is ready. I think Ukraine is ready. The other thing is how we interpret this inclusion, how we would politically establish this inclusion. Because for me, the contemporary strategies of LGBT organizations, the strategies that they use when they organize gay pride, as it was called, these neoliberal strategies are really close to conservative strategies when LGBT people want to be very, how to say, proper citizens, when they want to be included into structures. which are designed to exclude, to make others. So this legislation, this way of legislation, will do no difference in the entire political situation with other LGBT people. You know, this legislation will do the others. When LGBT representatives said they said that we are not freaks, we are normal people. So this way of speaking, as I would estimate, is quite a conservative way to present themselves on the political scene, on the stage.
Thank you. And another question for all of you. We see that when we're talking about the gender movement, anti-gender movement, but there is also this, like everyday homophobia, which I would not really call anti-gender movement, which is active and the everyday homophobia is passive. But let's talk about the economy of homophobia. People who defend traditional values, who are actively anti-gender, what's their economy? Why do they benefit from homophobia? Why do they benefit? Why do they feel that they would lose if the gender movement wins? Why do they sometimes think that this is a zero-sum game for them? So what's the economy of homophobia?
Is this a way of power regime resistance, I think? I don't think, I never thought about that in the terms of economy and benefits from homophobic speeches. But for me, this is the attempt, the endeavors to keep the things as they are. It is a fear to change the things in the world.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because it first of all, it attracts all these people that have some vested interest in this status quo of which these heterosexual arrangements are part of. So anyone that becomes uncertain if this is going to change has a vested interest in keeping things as they are. And that's a powerful source. The Netherlands was an early country in having same-sex marriage. Belgium was much later. I'm from Belgium. I've seen how it changed my family's attitudes towards me. It meant they didn't have to be so much afraid about what the neighbors would think that I'm a lesbian, now that the law was changed. So this means that before, I was a risk to their reputation, right? And that's a powerful thing, to be a risk to someone's reputation, because you can't avoid being that. But on the more meso level or macro level, there's large, powerful actors that have vested interest in homophobia. And I think there's some people that analyze, you probably know, or then I tell you, that the Catholic Church as an organized religion, as a semi-state, they have 250 ambassadors in the world. They're not just a religion, they're not just a church, they're a semi-state actor. They have, some people say, they have turned to moral issues like sexuality because they have lost so much power on other issues. They've lost so much material power. And then to choose morality issues as a next battlefield, it just shows how much power they have lost. So for many actors, it's a domain that they choose as a battlefield, when other domains don't seem so productive anymore. And I do not think that often they have a real opinion on that. It's just their choice of making something happen politically. And But that's a very powerful thing to do. In many cases, the far right in Europe, like Marine Le Pen, she uses it for xenophobic reasons in trying to claim that she will help French women combine work and family life by increasing welfare state arrangements for that. French woman is the key in what she says. She means not those of migrant origin. She taps into a whole narrative that those people abuse the welfare state. And therefore she can claim to be gender equal. I think she could expand that eventually to sexual equality issues, but after these manifestations with 1 million people, it's getting a bit difficult in France. But in the Netherlands, this is similarly used. Wilders has a vested interest in gender equality and sexual equality because it's his weapon against the Muslims in the Netherlands. It's why he can tell the society that those are not true Dutch people because they don't embrace the true Dutch values of sexual equality and gender equality. So there's many different ways in which this economy works, and they contradict each other. Right? There might be contexts in which it is beneficial for political actors to be against sexual equality, and there's situations where it's good for them to be in favor of that. And that makes it so complicated to address it.
Thank you. I think it's a very important question. And if you look at the different anti-gender movements, you see that in the European context, that there is always this existential threat which is there as a trigger, and this scare for loss of status, scare for the globalization, scare because of the 2008 collapse of the economic collapse. So this has got some economic and cultural reasons why this economy is very much prevailing. And I would say that very much supporting what Mieke was saying about how this is changing position, because if you look at the Hungarian far right, you see that this recent refugee crisis was really helping them to transform the party into a modern far-right party, because previously the main enemy were the Jews, and that was a party which still remained in the third wave of the far-right parties, and by now there is a new enemy at sight, which was previously not there, the Muslims, and there is a serious issue here, what if they will change the agenda regarding the same-sex marriage. But definitely when we are talking about this economy, we should look at it in a global context. Namely that, as Walter Benjamin said, that these issues, this hate is always showing the weakness of the leftist ideas and the weakness of critical thinking. So we see that also from a self-critical perspective, that the weakening of the European left and the social democracy is also contributed to not giving alternatives or strong messages to this strengthening economy.
Thank you. So I think that the gay rights movement, or the gay movement, which began as a sexual liberation movement, sometime in the 90s in the West became a movement for access to institutions. And people generally have a hard time believing that giving other groups access to institutions will not harm their own standing within those institutions. It's the way a lot of movements have worked. It's unfortunately, I think, that turning itself into a movement for access to institutions is what made the gay movement in the West successful, but it's also part of the reason that this choice of target in Russia has been so incredibly successful. Because it's so, in the post-Soviet situation, it resonates so well, right? We're all used to scarce resources. In the Soviet Union, access to an institution was the only thing that guaranteed economic well-being. So it's very easy to frame it as a zero-sum game. But I also, going back to what a couple of other people have mentioned, and to your question about whether our countries are ready, I think that another reason that it's been so easy to launch this anti-gay campaign in Russia, and this is where I'd be careful about talking about everyday homophobia, because I think that there's a huge gap between the campaign and everyday homophobia, and I don't think it really tapped into something deep-seated. I don't think that that Russians were sitting around hating gays, and then the Kremlin said, "Oh, well, let's hate them politically." Russians were sitting around not thinking about the gays, and when asked, thought that they'd never met a gay person, and then suddenly. And that's actually the reason it was so easy to start the campaign, because homosexuality had not been part of the public conversation ever. When it became part of the public conversation in the West, we had the Soviet Union. We didn't talk about sex. We didn't officially we didn't have sex in the Soviet Union. So the moment that the Kremlin started talking about sexuality, or would pass for talking about sexuality, it owned the whole conversation. There wasn't even language in which to speak back. But at the same time, if you look at our shared history, of Russia and Ukraine and other Soviet countries, there were so many shifts in the official line on family and private life in the course of the 20th century. And it was one of the ways in which, in fact, people in Soviet society were kept on their toes. You had to know what was, certain things, certain party lines were always constant, but others were dynamic. And this was one area that was dynamic. It changed with every generation. And to know what the right thing to think about family was, you had to be paying attention. Because we had a period just in the course of the 20th century of completely abolishing marriage, restoring marriage, banning divorce, banning abortion, de facto legalizing polygamy, by in an effort of in the post-war effort to legitimize out of wedlock births. And now the anti-gay campaign falls in line with that, because it's people are used to paying attention to what the party, or what we now have instead of the party, tells them to think about the private sphere. But I think that habit of having that be a very dynamic space actually means that if things work out differently in Ukraine could very easily, I think, change its attitudes.
Thank you. And of course, Russia now positions itself as a kind of a defender of the traditional values, family values, and even tries to position as this leader of a conservative movement in the world. One of the arguments that Russian officials have, and this one is coming, and I will try to rephrase what Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister of Russia, said. He said that Europe and the US, who are pushing for accepting gay rights and accepting this gender equality, they do this because this is a postmodern world that transcended the traditional values. But there are countries in the world who still live in the what they would call traditional values civilization, and so they would. The Russian officials who support this line, they would basically argue that gender equality, gay rights, this is not a universal thing. This is not a universal value. That's a value that belongs to the West. Basically, they will accuse the gender movement of being Western imperialists, who are trying to impose their own values, which are not universal for them, for the whole world. What do you think about this?
Well, actually, what's extraordinary about Lavrov's statement is that Sergei Lavrov is usually the civilized face of Russian politics, he will say things in ways that are palatable to his interlocutors. Whereas in this particular case, he's repeating almost verbatim the words of Alexander Dugin, who even in Russia is perceived as a marginal far-right figure. So this is what Alexander Dugin says, and you'll hear, and I know this by heart, I've quoted it enough times. So Alexander Dugin says there are two kinds of civilizations in the world. There's the Western civilization with its idea of universal human rights, which apply to post-gender people and post-human people. And that is fine. If the West wants to live in that world, that is fine for the West. What they shouldn't be doing is they shouldn't be pushing it down our throats. Because there are two kinds of civilizations in the world. In addition to the Western civilization, there is the traditional value civilization. And there is nothing universal about universal human rights. Right? That's a key phrase. I mean, what are you asking? What we say to that in response to that? What can you say in response to that? I mean, if we subscribe to the notion of human rights, then they're universal. If we reject the notion of human rights, then they're not universal. It's an impossible argument to engage in.
Is it part of the Western imperialist rhetoric, gender equality? Mieke, what do you think?
If I take the microphone, yes. The act is the answer, right? So maybe I should say something about it. But it's I think part of what I mentioned in the beginning, that gender and sexuality have entered the area of high politics. It's one of the things that are chosen now in big geopolitical fights. And I think Russia's not the first in doing that. There were other people having ideas about different civilizations in the world, and they were putting similar kind of distinctions. And so I think there are some very clever politicians in this Kremlin that just copycat what others have been taking. So I think the big danger is to not see this as an attempt at framing a certain discussion, but to see it as something that is real already before it is real, because it will become real, of course, when such a campaign starts to outline such a narrative and to spread such a narrative. It might become real, but I don't think it is real at this moment. But once you start to take it serious at that level of realness, I think that's very dangerous. And I think I was very happy with you saying Ukraine is ready for this. And I've seen it happen, that changes in law also make it visible. What this homophobia of my parents, what was it? It was not a real homophobia. It was a lot of anxiety of being excluded in the village, all these type of things. Is that homophobia? Yeah, it's a form of homophobia because it expresses itself as such. But once you eliminate that source, it's kind of gone. And it might not be gone completely, but to a large extent, enough for me to live comfortably. So that I think is where you should try and see what you can do, and can see how you can express these feelings, like what you said. I think this is incredibly important to say these things and to claim the right against some kind of politicians with very different interests. What you think is real, because it is a competition between claims about reality in a certain
Maria, maybe the same question, but also please think whether a potential increase, although it's maybe not an increase now of some, anti-gay rhetoric, anti-gay narratives in Ukraine, but I think if increase does happen, would that would that be hindering a process of Ukraine's European integration? Will that somehow decrease the level of support for integration with Europe? Do you think that homophobia can somehow influence in a negative way the pro-European aspirations of the Ukrainians?
Thank you. And just one word about traditional values. I just wanted to mention that there is no the final end, how deep into tradition you can go. You know, with this.
What kind of tradition you can invent?
In the way of looking for tradition, definitely. You know, it seems to me that now we are witnessing the situation when like pro-European forces in Ukraine, the anti-European forces in Ukraine, use this word Gayropa, also to frighten, to scare those who would like to join European values. So for me, the homophobia is quite common for entire population, not for the particular group of people. That is why it seems to me that how your question is, how did you ask again? Sorry, if it can prevent us from
yes, whether the антигомофобные сентименты в обществе могут ли они повлиять на снижение проевропейских настроений?
Yes, that is why it seems to me that this issue exists, but I wouldn't say that. I would say that we can overcome this problem because it seems to me that in Ukraine it is not good to be like homophobic person. In my institution, for example, this is Academy of Sciences. They usually claim that we are not homophobic. We don't share homophobic attitudes. But at the same time, they can ask, where do you see homophobia? It simply does not exist in Ukraine. So the way of recognition of homophobia in society is a way to overcome it and to work with the issue. I would say this way.
Thank you. So what I wanted to say is that universal human rights, they are a product. So it did not come without, it is not obviously given like this bottle, but it was a long fight to make universal human rights universal. And it's what we see is that certain revisionisms are actually present from the beginning, and certain counter forces and counter streams. And what I find particularly interesting, that how come that these counter streams and oppositions to universal human rights, which was a kind of global consensus in 1945, is actually questioned. So what are the factors which contributed to this questioning, and how openly this new vocabulary and new terminology is being introduced? So I particularly find this something important to study and to critically engage with this, especially because it is partly related to historical revisionism, to rewrite, reinvent the past, and to come up with concepts which had got very loaded prehistory, and it's partly a process which is considering this universal human rights as something which is particularly connected to the neoliberal US global economy. Consequently, the decline of the American influence is somehow connected to this concept. Consequently, it means that this is a tabooized issue which needs to be addressed. And so your question about is this related to imperialism, the question is of course how this this value system is transmitted, maintained, and somehow constructed, because we see that this is necessarily an issue which is so important and so much questioned by different actors. And this is a particularly important moment because not only in Russia but in other countries there are certain forces which are actually questioning this consensus, which was actually an anti-fascist consensus. And what is very funny is that at the moment there is only one country which is so anti-fascist, which is Russia. So here we have got lots of issues and questions which we haven't thought we have to deal with, but definitely we have to look at it in a global context. So I would suggest us, when we are thinking about this critically, to move away from this methodological nationalism, and that's why I really like to work in this project on this gender as symbolic glue, because everybody is saying that we in Poland, we in Slovakia, we in Hungary. On the other hand, we are seeing our whole world changing, and the question is who will be shaping this new agenda. And at the moment, what I have to say is that those who are in this secular human rights framework, they are in a defensive. And the question is how to move from this defensive position into a not offensive, but a kind of agenda-setting position again, because that's what we found in this book, that when analyzing the responses from the different actors, NGOs, LGBT movements, that mostly it's a defensive position. And from a defensive position, it's very difficult to come up with something new.
Yeah, thank you for all of you, and we now open the floor to the questions.
Good evening. My name is Marіі Маєрчик. I'm a PhD student in Kyiv Mohyla Academy. I would like to thank you first of all for your wonderful discussion, and I have several questions. The first one is concerning far-right and conservative movements in Europe. You mentioned that contemporary conservatives in Europe pick up the topic of LGBT rights as in support of it. But there are still conservative movements which are against LGBT rights. And I would like to ask, how do they interact with each other? So, I mean, does LGBT rights issue turn into kind of new political frontier or not? And how it affects conservative and new right politics? And who is actually winning now in this, if there is a controversy, so who is more popular, those far rights and conservatives who support LGBT rights, or those who are against? And the second question was concerning how European LGBT movement reacts to this appropriation of LGBT rights by conservatives. So do they support it, or they try to distance themselves from it? And the third question is oh, okay. Well then, thank you.
Do we collect or do we?
Why don't we collect? There's not that much time.
Hi, I'm speaking of Wojnowski. I work in Astana. I want to take issue with something I said at the very beginning and then ask one question. You said that gay identity or gayness as such didn't really exist in the USSR before 1991, but it did very much in the 1920s and the 1930s. I mean, the USSR was really the first state to legalize homosexuality, wasn't it? Well, okay, but the question I have is, are there any attempts to reconceptualize homosexuality as not something coming from the West, but something actually rooted in Soviet history?
Okay, good evening. I'm a student from Kyiv Mahila Academy. Hello. I had a question about, I don't remember who, one of you said that one of the kind of political stance gay people are taking today is the one that we are just normal people, we're not freaks, and that we look exactly like heterosexual gender-conforming couples, just we're two dudes or we're two girls. And I was asking, because this isn't, as you mentioned, a particularly powerful or particularly fair stand in many cases, do we think we can skip this? Is it possible to avoid this step of assimilation and instead kind of take the stand that gender equality activists are taking right now in the US and in Europe? Thank you.
Hello. I have a question about education in countries you presented. Why I ask about education? Because for me, if you like to hear my observation on Ukrainians, most of parents who have kids, they are not really people who let's say, cannot accept homosexual people. But when there is a talk about the kids, they are easily turned into people who are really afraid, because they think that it can bring many difficulties to their kids, to children. And then I think they think that sexual identity or homosexual identity is constructed by example. They don't know how the homosexual identity is constructed. And for me, it's really a missing point in Ukraine. We don't have many programs. We don't have really understanding how it's actually happening. And this is the key word and fears of many parents who are mostly not so crazy people in Ukraine. This is what I notice. And if you can share some I don't know, knowledge even about this, I would be thankful. Thanks.
I think maybe we'll now answer the questions and then see if we have time for the second one.
I can take the Soviet history question. I think that's a very, I've heard that narrative before. It has very little relationship to historical facts, right? So the story that was being told by, I think in America in the 70s and 80s about the Soviet Union was that it was the first country to legalize homosexuality. In fact, all laws of the empire were abolished after the October Revolution. The law against homosexual sex was among all those laws. It was re-established in 1934. The Soviet Union very briefly sort of flirted with radical family structures and flirted with the idea of going to the International Congress on Sexualities in Brno in 1933 and 1934, and then backed out of it. That was, it was a really brief period. The idea that there was a sort of flowering of gay culture in the Soviet Union is simply not true. I don't see how telling that tale would advance any cause at this point. I can tell you from personal experience that I wrote the only book of mine that has been translated into Russian is a book about a mathematician named Grigory Perelman who solved the Poincare conjecture. In that book, part of one chapter is taken up by the story of Andrei Kolmogorov, who was the greatest Russian mathematician of all time, who was gay, or who was homosexual. And I based this conclusion that he was a homosexual not on some secret knowledge, but on his published love letters to his partner of 50 years, another mathematician named Pavel Alexandrin. And I was vilified by Russian reviewers for casting that aspersion on a great Russian by calling him what he was, or placing a label on him. So I don't think that would be an effective sort of public tack. And I'm not sure that I'm going to the sort of conservatism question. I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, but I think you asked whether there's a possibility of reframing the gay rights movement as in a similarly radical way to the gender equality movement in the US and Europe. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm afraid that I don't share your optimism about the gender equality movement in the US. I think that it's, or at least if you mean transgender equality, I think that it's very rapidly undergoing the same metamorphosis as the gay liberation movement, which is that it's giving way to this to new conservatism, where kids are offered the choice between, in this binary structure, okay, if you don't want to be a girl with a pink room like we expect you to be, you can be a boy with a blue room. That's fine, because we're very, we're very progressive, we're very liberal, not progressive, we're very liberal parents, and we will let you be what you are. And I'm absolutely horrified at watching this happen and watching this rhetoric absolutely take hold in the States.
Thank you very much for the wonderful questions. This is really great to receive them. And going back to the first question about conservatism and this uncertainty and mixture of different political concepts and cleavages, I would say that you actually touched upon something very important. Namely that we are in a phase of restructuring, reconstructing the political sphere. So those cleavages we saw clear-cut, and we know, who stands where and what kind of agenda is placed where, is actually over. So that's why we call this book Gender as symbolic glue, because in this, the authors of this book actually agreed that gender is a kind of magnet, which is the issue of gender and gender equality is a magnet, which is somehow reconfiguring, restructuring the political space and the political parties. So those parties whom you expect are supporting this, this, and this, and this, suddenly they are on the other side. And that's why this roundtable discussion is so timely, because gender is a symbolic glue, which is actually gluing together those unholy alliances and unholy concepts and actors who are otherwise, they have got nothing to do together. But I think that it actually shows this intermediate transformation where we are now. And as far as the leftist roots are concerned, I think that's a very legitimate question to ask. Is there a space for universal human rights in a leftist progressive framework? Because so far we only talked about the liberal framework. And I think your question actually asks that one. And this is something which requires more research of the critical approach of the leftist tradition, which actually hadn't been done in the past 20 years in the former communist countries. And as far as the education is concerned, I believe that if you look at the different anti-gender movements, the scare from the sexual education, mandatory sexual education, being introduced in the school is a major factor. Is a major factor in all European countries we studied in this. We studied in this project. So France, Germany, Hungary, Poland and Slovakia, this was actually a crucial factor which contributed to this scare factor, and which I already mentioned in one of my contributions. So the scare from the unknown, the scare from the change, the scare from the loss of status, the scare from the other. So here I think the European Union reports and directives, they play a crucial role as far as changing the norms are concerned. And since the education is a nation-state competency, therefore we see that in the different national levels they are appearing differently, but they are very much the same.
Okay, so many questions, and I would like to say something to almost all of them. I think the first question on these differences within the far-right parties that are substantial, and you could see that in the European Parliament when they tried to make a group of these parties in Europe, and they did not succeed yet, not this time. I think the next elections is when you're going to see that this might happen, because some of the bottlenecks for this have already been eliminated. Marine Le Pen has gotten her father out of the way, and therefore this whole Holocaust question out of the way with the French Front National, which was one of the divisive issues. Another one is on gender, and that's another. So but they might solve those kind of divisions, and then we're in deeper trouble, right? So for now, we should be happy that they're not all pulling one eye. And but they're working on it because it brings a lot of money. It's the economy of it. If they can be one bloc in the European Parliament, they will gain enormous power and enormous access to financial resources. So of course they're deeply, deeply engaged in working towards this. And the other element, the movement, there are a large amounts of people trying to find out what the far-right parties are doing, what the Holy See, the Catholic Church, and the other churches are doing on this. There's people that are going to see this video of the discussion. There's a whole group organized by David Paternot in Brussels and Roman Kuhar in Ljubljana, and a lot of other people working on books, investigating in all these countries what happens, seeing what the church is doing, what other actors are doing, who's financing all of that, how the transnationalization of this far-right movement is impacting how that, which money is coming from the US, how all that works together. How Putin is financing Le Pen, so they work very, very deeply on these issues. I would say that way, because it's highly needed, of course, right? And I think the very nice question, if it's unavoidable that this is like always normalizing, if you have sexual equality, you see that there are bits and pieces where it's not. And where sometimes what you think, like this marriage equality might be normalizing and completely eliminating queer culture, but maybe not. We see in the Netherlands now that we have the political demand on the table to recognize that families can consist of more than 2 adults with children. And I think that's a more radical kind of position. And it's only possible because we have marriage equality. So it can be a follow-up to that. And we see in the whole discussion around intersex people that this can be an opening where trans equality often fails. Because that's where the demand for having more positions than 2 binary positions comes from. So there is possibilities to try to escape normalizing. And that's good that they are, but it's of course the tendency will always be to normalize, and they will always be needed to work against that. And on education, I think there is, again, I think it's better to see this as a whole politics around it. These parents are just worried about their kids, the way parents always worry about their kids. And there is people that mobilize this into a politics of fear. And there's people that can mobilize a total different politics. The Netherlands, we have large projects that are called Schools Out, where the LGBT organizations are closely linked with schools and organizations, and they make sure there is no kid in the Netherlands that has not actually seen a human being that is called lesbian or trans or gay, so that they see that those are human beings, and so that they see that those can have a good life and be recognized as nice and serious and good people. And that makes a difference. Yeah, but you see, on the other hand, that lots of Western countries, also Italy, the district of Venice, has abandoned all sorts of books from the schools that are supposed to be perverse. They're all about sexuality, of course, and about gender roles. So it's an ongoing struggle, unfortunately.
I would like to answer the question if we can avoid a step of assimilation. If we reject the strategy of fitting or strategy to be normal, and if we understand normativity as a regime of power, then of course we can elaborate another way to struggle, another way to get rights, avoiding the strategy to be included in the system that made us perverts.
Yeah, maybe I'll move a bit because it's very close to. Thanks again for the discussion. Like really short comment, but I feel obliged to voice it publicly because I think it's one of the most crucial political problems that we have today in Ukraine. So it's like I think there is one thing still missing in today's debate. You know, like in all these horror films about exorcism, usually the priest, when he comes to the bed of the patient who is under the devil, so to say. So the first thing he is asking the devil is tell your name. Spell your name. Tell what is your name. That is like a priori to start fighting with it. So I think the name is missing today, and because actually that is the answer. Who is afraid of Gayropa? And I think we shouldn't be afraid to put it publicly. Who is actually afraid? And so I mean we have to say that they are fascists. That if you are afraid of Gayropa, you are fascist. Because you see, I will give you two examples which are really like symptomatic for our context. So like 5 years ago in December, we, in the framework of conference about neo-racism, we organized a demo, a protest called Anti-Yolka, and Maria was also part of that. So it was like some constellation of different NGOs, together with Antifa, with LGBT NGOs. And we went like on a march on Hreshchatyk Street, and we were followed by neo-Nazis. And we were going back to our center to leave all the stuff after the demo, and they were going in the next wagon in the metro, following us. And when we went out on the metro station, which actually Kontraktova Square, so they went out as well, and before they started to attack, it was really very interesting. The first thing they asked, why are you protesting with faggots? So yeah, they hated us as political enemies, but they emphasized, why are you with them? And another example which somehow demonstrates the shift after Maidan, maybe, that it's maybe my personal story, but which has a political meaning as well. When I was attacked last year, the first thing they were calling me, and before the attack, they started to cry out, he's a communist, he's a separatist, catch him, beat him. So I mean here that it's not about gender only, it's not about sexuality, because we are dealing with a constellation of hatreds. It's a fascism, that is the nature of it. Because in this case, gender is a Jew, when you are defending LGBT, you can be equal to a communist, then to a liberal, to anybody, whom are they opposing. And actually the problem in Ukraine is that even in those cases when neo-fascists in Ukraine are arrested, they have killed actually recently a couple of policemen even, but nobody no state body and no media are calling them with their real name. So I mean, if you are like using some substitutes, they are just presented as patriots, nationalists, or like members of some groups, but nobody calls them with their real name. I think that in spite of having this fascistoid, quasi-anti-fascist Russia, we are obliged, if we are thinking politically and if we are really like sticking to some universal values, we are obliged to call the enemy with its real name. I think it's like a political position and somehow what is our obligation today as well. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion. So there was some mentioning here of gender issues entering high politics, and I think that's definitely true. I'm from Sweden, and during the last election campaign, everyone was all of a sudden a feminist, which was a little bit strange. But you know, again, I mean, that might be a good or a bad thing. But I would like to hear your reaction to that conceptual inflation. How can we sort of embrace the broadening of the movement and at the same time keep some sort of worthwhile definition of what feminism or you know, advocates of LGBTQ issues is really about?
Yes, thank you for coming. You mentioned Ukraine and other Eastern European countries as the countries where LGBT discrimination is still rampant. And like the question about Ukraine, what can be done for diminishing the concept, the fears, the fears of this gender ideology, the fears of Gayropa? Because believe me, there are lots of so-called pro-European people in Ukraine who fully accepted our pro-European choice, but they are afraid of this so-called gender ideology. Many Western people, like Westerners, think that homophobia in Ukraine, or this concept Gayropa, comes from Russia, but it's not always that way. Like, what can be done for diminishing this concept, this stupid fear?
Unfortunately, we only now have time for the answers. I'm very sorry for this.
I think the question about the fascist is an element in what I had also been thinking of, which is that in many cases, when we think about the movement, when we think about the feminist movement, there's been a concept called the velvet triangle. It's when all sorts of actors start to move in the same direction, which makes it a lot stronger. There's been a lot of talk about intersectionality and different movements for social justice working together, thereby making them stronger. Unfortunately, and I think when we look at anti-gender movements, anti-sexual equality movements, we don't always see that these counter forces all work together. In the Netherlands, they don't all work together. But in some cases, they do, and that's when it gets really, really dangerous. So I understand what you say as your assessment that in the case of Ukraine, that they work too closely together, and therefore they're much more dangerous, because what is then added to the mix, of course, is violence, right? Which is so far in the Netherlands not a collective problem. So I think it's very good that you brought that up, and the question how we can keep the LGBT element in focus is a highly needed one. I mean, Maria, you said in the beginning that the gender studies people sometimes wanted to distance themselves from the LGBT issues. And we've seen that all around the feminist movement, all around the world, at any point in time, that feminists said that, yeah, but you shouldn't talk because you look too lesbian, so then it will give us a bad name if you speak, so better someone else speak. So these divisions between the movements is what makes us weak. And yeah, we should try and overcome those and have more alliances. So, and the first element is, of course, that calling it a problem, what you did, is an important element. in trying to address that, I think.
Thank you very much for the questions. I have got two comments. One is a general one about strategy and about naming. If you look at this book, we analyzed the different counter strategies, and what we found in the case of these 5 countries, that the naming and shaming works the least. And of course, contexts are different, but what we found is that this naming is actually prisoning not the target and gives a border to the target, but actually those who are giving that label. So what we found, there are lots of other possible counter strategies. For example, the feminist movement and needs to learn how to do politics in a professional way, for example. And this is a professionalization of politics in a sense. So my plea is to think very carefully about the strategy of naming and shaming, because that can be very counterproductive and paralyzing. And the other is that definitely we are living in a formation of a new world, and this is a Gramscian socializational fight. Therefore, every actor is promoting its ideology in a certain sense, so we should not be shy to do the same. Thank you.
So to the naming issue, I'm not in a position to talk about a political strategy. I'm in a position to talk as a writer. I think that everything should have a precise description. The issue here, though, is that the only people who are calling the Ukrainian far-right fascists is the Russian media. And so it's actually a very tricky situation in which there's I think there's sort of a counter-reaction to that here. There's also, interestingly, a reaction to it in American media, which dominates the terminology that is used in Western media. And I've encountered this problem recently in referring to the right sector in a couple of articles, and in 2 different publications. One is Foreign Affairs, which should be a fairly sophisticated magazine in terms of terminology. The other one is the New York Times. In both publications, my description of the right sector was changed to read just nationalist. And in both situations, I wrote to the editor explaining that, labeling something nationalist when describing the political landscape in a country that is fighting a post-colonial war is ridiculous. And the need to let me describe the political forces in more precise ways. They agreed, but that's, I think it's a real uphill battle. I'm not sure that fascist is actually, as a term, particularly useful, because it's also incredibly imprecise. Precise descriptions are also hard to come by.
I just want to say a few words about the question, your question about the gender politics, that this is the object of fear and why. And I always find this surprising that a post-Soviet society is afraid of gender politics. What is strange, because gender equality was like state politics for dozens of years, and now we see it as something very strange and new and brought from the West. So it seems to me that we have to consider the new influence of church on society and why our understanding of gender equality changes so much, and what is the source, where it comes from, that we understand gender equality as something dangerous for us.
Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much for the audience. And